Happy Friday the 13th. Tonight I'm sharing a ghost story that depicts one of the scariest situations of all time. Taking your work home with you. This is The Kit Bag by Algernon Blackwood, published in 1908.
Fucked up fairy tales with Liz.
Ding! The verdict was not guilty by reason of insanity. But John Turk's defense team was somber at the outcome. While many agreed only an addled mind could commit such a heinous murder, those in the courtroom wanted to see the man locked up with the key tossed in the Thames. But Wilbraham and Sons presented a compelling defense, and Turk was released. The firm's secretary, a young man named Johnson, was particularly disturbed by the entire trial. He couldn't get John Turk's face out of his mind. The murderer had the appearance of a vampire, with pale, dull skin and black hair combed over his sullen expression. He looked exactly like the type of man who would kill and dismember a young woman, packing up her body with lime and toting her remains around London. Wilbraham Sr. saw Johnson's faraway expression and tried to distract him. "You're off on a holiday tomorrow, yes?" Johnson was grateful for the distraction. "Indeed, a week of skiing and skating in the Alps. The timing is impeccable after this last week." His boss told him to try and let it go. "The more you dwell on that type of story, the harder it is to push from your mind. Have fun on your trip." The men shook hands. Johnson remembered something. "I say, do you have a kit bag I could borrow for the trip?" Wilbraham nodded. "I'll have one sent to your flat." The secretary hurried to dinner and then home, his shoulders hunched against the sleet and rain mucking up the streets. He rented a room on the top of a skinny old boarding house. He was the only long-term resident, so other than his landlady, Mrs. Monks, he never got familiar with the other inhabitants. When he arrived back that night, Mrs. Monks met him at the door and pointed to the stairs, where the kit bag from Mr. Wilbraham's house was awaiting him. Johnson reminded the woman of his upcoming trip, telling her where to forward his mail, then scooped the bag up and brought it upstairs. Johnson put a pot of coffee on, and between the pleasant aroma, the tapping of sleet on the window, and organizing his bright holiday jumpers, his mood improved. His boss's bag wasn't the most glamorous luggage, but it was sturdy and roomy. He was able to fit in most of his leisure wear and dinner clothes, and then some. He realized he'd forgotten to lay out his dress shirt, so he left the kit bag on the bed and began rifling through his wardrobe. The muffled sound of heavy footsteps interrupted his thoughts. They were coming up the stairs towards his floor. Johnson stopped, puzzled. It was past 10 p.m. at this rate, but before he could place who the footsteps might belong to, they dissipated. "Maybe one of the other residents is a little tipsy and walked up a couple extra flights," he said to himself. He brought his starched white shirts to the kit bag, but he hesitated before putting them in. He saw for the first time how old and dirty the bag was, and that surprised him. His boss was a fastidious man. He also didn't seem to be the type of person who would send over his worst bag on loan. But Johnson shrugged it off, tucking the rest of his belongings inside. Then he heard the footsteps again, this time treading back and forth in the apartment below his own. Johnson walked to the door and opened it a crack, to gauge what he could hear from the landing. The footsteps stopped. He turned back to his packing, then gaped at the kit bag on his bed. The brass fastenings and folds of the object fell such that the bag had the appearance of a grimacing face. The image of the eerie John Turk flashed in his mind. He laughed at himself, but he turned on another lamp. Once again, footsteps paced the hard wood floors of the flat below. This time, Johnson hurried down to the next floor, tentatively opening the door to the unoccupied rooms. "Hello? Is anyone in here?" The flat was unfurnished and empty. Johnson walked over to the landing. "Mrs. Monks, have you been showing the third floor tonight?" But there was no answer. Johnson shook himself and hurried back to his rooms. But where he sought comfort, he was further thrown. For the kit bag was laying in the middle of his room, a few paces from where he'd been packing it on the bed. "It simply fell over when I rushed out," he told himself. He hurried to pick up the bag and replace it, humming a Christmas carol a little too loudly to indicate authentic cheer. The sleeve of one of his shirts and a few accessories had jostled out of the bag in the fall. Johnson tucked them back in, then paused, his song trailing off. He peeled back the inside of one flap and grimaced. Were these bloodstains? He sat on the bed and took some deep breaths. His boss was right. The details of the trial had nestled themselves in the folds of his mind to a distressing degree. He sat down at his desk and made a list of what he'd need for the trip to ensure he didn't forget anything, and to ease his mind. He checked off each item, then realized he had forgotten his goggles. He rifled around in his bin of winter duds. As he did, a shadow passed over him. He turned, and out of the corner of his eye, he saw the figure of a man standing by the window. He jumped up, dropping the goggles with a clatter. But there was no one there. Hands shaking, Johnson retrieved the eyepiece and inspected it for cracks. He returned to the bed, wrapping the goggles in a scarf for safekeeping. Other than his shaving kit and a few other toiletries, they were the last item he needed to pack. He pulled the zipper of the kit bag shut and decided to leave the bag by his washroom. He grabbed the handles, but he encountered some resistance. He felt around the bag to ensure it wasn't caught on the bedpost and tried again. Some unseen force played tug-of-war with him. He had the distinct feeling that someone, something, was not happy with his use of the kit bag. "It's just a bag," he announced to the air, "and a bag can't hurt you." Still, he let go of the object, and the bag suddenly lurched forward of its own accord. Johnson screamed and scrambled back. He tripped over a chair, and as he fell, his arm hit the electric light switch, dousing the room in darkness. He pressed himself against the wall, whimpering in terror. In the dark, he heard the kit bag fall off the bed, followed by the distinct drag of it across the floor. He scratched at the wall above him, frantically groping for the light switch. At last his fingers fumbled around the little brass knob, bringing light back to the room. But no comfort came with the glow, for standing over the bag was the hulking form of John Turk, who glowered at Johnson beneath his thick brow. "This is my bag," he grumbled. "I want it back." Vividly, the initial days of the trial flooded back into Johnson's mind. The prosecution's lurid descriptions of the victim, so thoughtlessly butchered and stuffed into a bag, made his head pound. The panicked young man stumbled to his feet and fled from the apartment, dashing down to the first-floor parlor, where he set every lamp ablaze and dragged a settee in front of the closed door. That done, he lost his senses entirely, crumpling to the floor in a faint. Hours later, Johnson woke up to the sound of wood scraping against the floor. He shrieked and sat up. Mrs. Monks, peeking in from the obstructed doorway, shrieked back. "Good gracious, Mr. Johnson! What are you doing down here and with the door blocked off?" "I am so sorry," Johnson replied, embarrassed and exhausted. I had a very peculiar night." He pulled the sofa back. Mrs. Monks entered with another man. It was his boss's personal assistant, holding a finely made, empty kit bag. "I'm so sorry to show up at this early hour," the man said. "There was a dreadful mistake last night. It seems evidence from the case ended up here, rather than the kit bag Mr. Wilbraham intended to send over. He didn't notice it until this morning, when he found the intended bag still waiting by his own door." Johnson was stunned. "Oh," was all he could come up with in response. He took the bag awkwardly. The man fiddled his fingers. "I'm supposed to take the other bag back, sir. It, um, I'm afraid it's the one that held that poor girl John Turk murdered." Johnson swallowed. "By all means." He showed the man upstairs. The room was a wreck, with furniture upturned from Johnson's scuffle. The kit bag lay in the middle of the room, with Johnson's items tumbling out of it in an odd trail. Do you mind emptying the rest of that bag yourself?" he asked. "You can just dump the contents on the floor. I cannot touch that thing again." "Of course." The man did one better, gently unloading Johnson's boots and skates and helping him assemble the rest of his supplies with no comments on the mess. He did attempt some chatter over the work, though. "Such a strange situation, isn't it?" "Isn't what?" Johnson replied. "John Turk. Did you not hear? He killed himself last night." Johnson started. "What?" "Yes," the man tutted, shaking his head. "Poisoned himself shortly after his release. He left a note for Mr. Wilbraham, too. He asked to be buried in the same way he left his victim, inside the same kit bag." Johnson felt faint once again. "What time did he take his life?" "At 10 p.m., sir." The man shook his head. "Ah," Johnson replied, shaken to the core. "A strange situation, indeed." Happy Friday the 13th! If your duffel bag is looking a little creepy to you now, don't worry about it. Oh my god, make sure you're following me wherever you can because I wrote a book. It's coming out next year and I want you to buy it.